So like I said before, time and place for work, once constants in the work equation are now variable. So we've got to figure that out. The other piece is just, 20 years of Agile and Scrum and tools and processes. And most of the tools we use today were kind of made before the pandemic, right? And we work differently now.
Today's guest is Henry Poydar, CEO and founder at Steady, with more than 25 years of experience in tech leadership roles. With Henry, we talked about continuous coordination, an open source framework he co created, providing a set of principles and practices for running modern, effective engineering teams. So let's dive right into it after a short word from our sponsor. Elite software teams demand great efficiency and developer experience. We are talking high output reliability and morale. So what's the secret? They've hand-built a platform to power a continuous improvement loop. And now you can have that too. Sleuth is your platform to empower this continuous loop quickly, pinpoint areas needing improvement, implement those improvements instantly with automations, and automatically measure their impact continuously. Improve as elite teams do with Sleuth automations. Hey, Henry, welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Luca. It's great to be here.
So, Henry, you are a CEO and founder at Steady, which helps software teams work better together. And
That's
it
right.
is backed by a framework, an open source framework, I should say, which you co created called
Yep,
continuous coordination, which
that's
gives a
right.
set of principles and practices for running modern knowledge work teams, I can
That's
say.
right.
And we are here today talking because you and I have known each other for many years, actually. And you recently let me know about continuous coordination, and I loved it. So I would love to explore what this is all about. But I will start by taking a small step back. And so my first question is, what has been your journey in tech, and how did you even get into building products and frameworks for software teams?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I've been in tech for quite a while, coming up on 25 years. Um, I went to college for mechanical engineering, and I graduated right at the time that the web was sort of getting started. And I was enamored with it, and I was enamored with the technology, and took some of the computer science that I had grown up with and knew from engineering, and started working in the web at that time. And I've worked as a developer, I've worked as a team lead, worked as a VP of engineering, I've worked as a CTO in all sorts of size companies, public companies, management consulting, but mostly at early stage startups. And in the early 2010s, I was the co-founder and CTO of a social CRM company startup called Bantam Networks.
Okay.
And our company was acquired by Constant Contact, which is a big email marketing company. And my job when I moved to Constant Contact was to shepherd the integration of our technology, of our CRM technology, into Constant Contact's giant
Yeah.
legacy IBM DB2 system. And so I spent 3 years at Constant Contact working on that project. I opened their first New York office. They opened up another one after I started, but um, um, built a team, worked with a distributed team in San Francisco, in Florida, in New York, in Boston. And we just worked on this giant project for 3 years.
Yeah.
And as probably some of your listeners know, it was quite a culture shock for me because I was coming from a double-digit startup
Yeah.
company to a 1,000-person public company, and so
Yeah. Was about
things
to
like
ask, was there like culture shock, even maybe technological shock coming into, different tech stack that was more legacy with respect to what I imagine was your tech stack and basically
yeah.
everything.
Well, I mean, it's sort of it. This is the start of my journey with Steady because it was communication shock,
Yeah.
right? There was no communication wasn't a problem. I mean, at the
Mm.
time we were using HipChat. There was email. There was whatever Microsoft had with Outlook and all this stuff. Like communicating with people was not a problem. It was communication overload that was a problem. So at a startup, my Gmail inbox, like every single email mattered. And when I got to the bigger company, one out of every 100 or 250 emails actually mattered. And so trying to sort that out and triage that was just a big part of the job. Um, um, and so when I left Constant Contact, I said, oh, what do I want to do now? And one thing I wanted to do, well, I had two things, two conditions for what I was going to do next. The first is that I wanted to go back to the metal, meaning I wanted to go build a product on my own, like write the code, write the CSS, work on the HTML, do the deployments. I wanted to do that by myself. I really wanted to get back to the metal because it's sort of like almost like woodworking for me, like modern age woodworking. I wanted to do that. And the second thing is I wanted to tackle a problem that I was really close to, right? And I remember at Constant Contact, as I was running this New York office, and I remember one morning in particular, I showed up and I walked into the office, and at the end of the office, we had a big whiteboard which had this massive roadmap on it, with this huge giant systems integration project, and there were some chairs around the whiteboard, and they had jackets on them, and I was like, okay, like that's the big thing that I have to do, and then these are the people that are going to help me do it. I don't know who they are. Like there's a person that was sitting there that their jacket is there. They're around here somewhere doing something for that.
Yeah.
And I don't have like hands on the wheel confidence to know what that is at any given time. And so, and I'm sure your listeners know this, but like that feeling of just a project running without feeling like you have your hands on the wheel is really disconcerting. And there's, as managers know, you're managing in two directions, right? You're trying to shepherd a team along and help people with their careers and build great software with them, and then you're also, trying to keep stakeholders in the loop and keep them informed. And so I struggled with that, when I was running this big project. And so when I left, I thought about that problem, and I built a product called Status Hero.
Yeah.
And Status Hero, which you're familiar with, was a very simple product. You set it up, and it essentially messaged via Slack or email everybody on your team and said, "What are you working on today?"
Yeah.
And the next day it would say, "Hey, yesterday you said your intention for the day was to work on this. Did you do that? Is that what you did or not? I mean, not in a punitive way, but just keeping everybody informed, sort of chaining together the kind of things that stand-ups do, but are hard to do across distributed teams."
Yes.
And we added bells and whistles to Status Hero. We integrated with Jira and GitHub and all these things. And I ran that Status Hero on my own for 5 years and really, really enjoyed it. And that's how I got to know you and your old company. And it was great. But it was always I was always only solving one half of the problem, right? It was solving for the team really, really well, but it wasn't solving for multiple teams. It wasn't solving for stakeholder communication and things like that. So, so I thought about that, and I thought about what I was going to do with that. I could keep on running it like it is. I mean, it did really well during the pandemic, obviously, because it solved a problem for remote and distributed teams. But I always felt like the real mission is to help people build better software products together, help whole organizations do that. And I was missing half of that. So I talked to some mentors and advisors and ended up raising a seed round for Status Hero to build Status Hero 2.0.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went out and hired people who had a lot of experience in the distributed workspace, from Microsoft, from GitLab, from Basecamp. And we got together and we started working on Status Hero 2.0.
Yeah.
And as it was coming together, and one of the real joys for me working with these incredibly smart, talented people is that we realize we're not building a tool or a product. We are building a tool or a product around our philosophy and our point of view on how people can successfully coordinate together to build great software products.
Yes.
And so as we were building this thing, we had a couple of offsites, and we were figuring this out. We decided to abstract our point of view into something that was very simple. Our product is around distilling information and making things simple and making messaging simple. And so we applied those same principles to actually to this notion of abstracting the concepts that the product was built around, and that's what continuous coordination is. So continuous coordination was codified in we'll call it a white paper, but it's really like a set of principles, like the much like the Agile Manifesto,
Yeah.
and launched Steady. That was in the end of 23, and then launched Steady in January of 24. So Steady is really status 0.2.0, but it is a turnkey implementation of the principles of continuous
Yeah.
coordination.
Love this story, and actually allows me to go a little bit back on time, because I absolutely remember starting using Status Hero, which is how we got in touch at the beginning. I think it was, I don't know, maybe 2018 or something like that. I don't even
Mm-hmm.
remember. And back in the day, I was running my startup. It was, a small team, smallish, like 20 people or so. I was the CTO, and we were running pretty much standard agile Scrum, out of the box with daily stand-ups. And that was the first time, I mean, trying to adopt Status Hero, that we steered away from, the standard way of doing things, and embedding more asynchronous communication into our workflow, turning regular stand-ups into something that happened on Slack, asynchronously on the tool. And now it seems obvious, because there is a lot more attention on remote work, written workflows. But back then, it was not very, very common, I should say. When I talked with my peers, other CTOs and co-founders that I knew, there was this sense of experimentations, but they were experiments, and
That's
it
right.
was obviously very and immediately very successful in our team. And that actually kind of started a small fire that is, okay, maybe we can start changing a few other things here and there. Maybe we can make this other small ceremony async and happening in a doc. Maybe we can move things around. It created that momentum that allowed
Yeah.
us to do more. And it's, looking back, it's incredible that it was so many years ago, and it kind of, you did this before it was cool, right? And I uh, and I can definitely see how this all took off with pandemic, with the whole
Yeah.
shift to remote work.
Yeah. Well, I think, you said it was experimental back then. I think it's still experimental
Yeah,
today.
yeah,
And I think that, that's a big driver for us with Steady and continuous coordination, is that we still think that orgs have generally not figured this out.
yeah,
And I think people understand that, okay, Agile is 20 years old. It was designed for a pre-COVID era.
yeah.
It was designed when the two constants of work, which work in general, but software teams too, of having time and place be constant for work.
Yes,
You know, those things are variable now. They're just variable, and so it's a different time. And so we need sort of a fresh approach to attack this. And one of the key pieces of continuous coordination is the word coordination,
mm,
because async communication is actually cheap and easy, and you can do it at any time. And that is actually kind of the problem. Like, we could communicate on Slack and email and fire off all these messages, and that's async communication. Great.
yeah,
But reading it and absorbing it, that's another story. And that's the part that you need the coordination piece for. That's why you need structure. And that's why we say, async communication with structure is really async coordination. Um,
yeah,
and one of the the North Star metric for steady is actually not checking in or inputs, it's the outputs. It's readership on the check-ins, it's readership on goal updates. That's the North Star metric.
Yeah.
Because as you can imagine, if you just tell your team, like, okay, everybody throw in your check-in on a Slack channel every day, and then it's gone, it's in the void, it's in the ether,
Yeah.
and that's detrimental. That can send you backwards, right? If
Yeah.
there's nothing worse as a contributor to craft an update, and then just have it lost in the void, or shouting into the void is really, or shouting into the wind
Yeah.
is really a morale sapping experience.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so I really want to dive into continuous coordination now
Yeah,
because I think this would be a fantastic conversation. And so the framework is based on 7 principles put together. And
right.
the first one, which I think is very important to understand the philosophy behind the whole framework, is keeping a steady beat.
Right.
And I would love you to elaborate on that because I think it's a very important piece because we've gone to this stage of saying, okay, we have to remove all the meetings, we can do everything async, but we never discuss instead what's the right way of staying in sync, right? I mean, it's like a pendulum that swings,
Yeah.
and there is even backlash now, teams that go back into the office or go back into doing more meetings. So what does a steady bit look like for you, and what this principle is about?
Yeah. So keeping a steady beat is what I talked about before. It's adding structure to async coordination at its core.
Yeah.
Um, and what you're trying to do, and you're very astute to pick up on that one first. And it's the reason that's the first principle is because it is the most important one. And when we talk about ways to implement continuous coordination, which we can talk about later, but
Yeah.
it's usually start with keep a steady beat, and then the other ones are supporting that.
Yeah.
So it is the most important one. But keep a steady beat is about avoiding what we call the alignment trap.
Mm.
So there's a very easy way to keep teams and people aligned, and that's just to meet all the time, right? So just meet,
Yeah.
just stay on Zoom all day, meet all the time, and I guarantee you'll be aligned. Everybody will think the same way. There won't be any confusion. But of course, you won't get any work done, right?
Yes.
You won't. No value will be created. And then there's the other side of the alignment trap, which you alluded to, which is like, okay, we're done with meetings. We're never gonna meet. We're only gonna, throw stuff into a Slack channel or on email, and then teams and people go off and work in the wrong direction because they're lacking the context that they got from those things.
Yeah.
So with keep a steady beat, you drip out context in a way that's beneficial to teams and people within these communication loops. And there's two loops. There's a small, we call it the small loop. It's a tight, frequent loop that's usually at the team level, akin to an async stand up,
Mm.
where people communicate in steady, it's smart check ins, but essentially their intentions for the day,
Yeah.
or intentions for the next couple of days, or intentions for the week, to the rest of the people that they're immediately working with within a team, usually.
Okay.
So that's the small loop. And then, and like I said before, there's a readership part to that too. Like the loops don't work unless everybody in the loop is actually consuming
Yeah.
the messages as well.
And is
And
it
then
a
there's a
daily
bigger
loop?
loop.
Is it a daily loop, or the cadence depends on the
We
team?
we it another thing with continuous coordination and why it's so why it's just principles and not a prescription,
Yeah.
right? Is because every org is different.
Okay.
Building software is subjective. Orgs are different; they're their own animals, and so a daily check-in works for one org, a weekly check-in works for another. It really, it depends. It's a very broad field. Um, but the bigger loop is around usually objectives or goals, and those things need updates.
Okay.
And the anti pattern is the way that some orgs do roadmap planning or do say OKRs, where you go to Confluence and you pick folder, August 2024 OKRs, and you put your thing in there, and then in September or probably like December, you go and you look at that folder, like, did we hit our OKR or not? So the
Been
big loop is
there,
around.
done that.
Yes, yeah. The big loop is around creating almost a micro blog around an objective or a goal that keeps everybody informed on a regular cadence at a
Mm.
steady beat. So if you have an objective to ship something at the end of 2024, you don't want that objective to just go and die in a
Yes.
doc somewhere in Google Drive. You want it to be alive. You want it to be updated. And so usually, and it depends on the org, but maybe once a month or once every 2 weeks,
Okay.
the owner of that goal is contributing to it. And then, the readership part, which Steady implements, is subscribing stakeholders to those updates
Yeah.
so that everybody gets informed.
And so your
And then by the time,
recommendation for this kind of loop is still to run this asynchronously. So it's status
yes,
updates that get propagated to the various stakeholders, and if there is any kind of interaction, it can be done through comments and written material that goes together with the updates themselves. But we don't need to jump in a meeting altogether.
yeah. Now,
It
there is a caveat
depends.
there. Yeah, well, but also, I'm a fan of great meetings. Meetings are great. I always think of that scene in I don't know if you saw the movie Apollo 13, where the astronauts are trapped up in space and the engineers on the ground need to figure out how to fix
Oh
their
yeah,
their
yeah, yeah,
oxygen
yeah.
needs. And they say they dump a bunch of parts on a table, and the engineers gather around and like, we got to make this fit into this in the next 2 days. Like, how do we do it?
Yes.
Like, that's an awesome meeting. Like, I want to
Yeah.
be a part of that. And so by doing those things asynchronously, those updates, you're actually optimizing for great meetings,
Yeah.
because you can't just be on the other side of the alignment trap and just go off on your own. Even though the async pieces are keeping everybody informed, humans collaborate. We need to meet, right?
Yes.
We need to talk. We need to work things out.
Yeah,
Um,
I love the
and
Apollo 13 example. I mean, and I think we can take clues from that scene and
yes,
think about, so what's a great meeting? What there are the ingredients for you that make a situation right for a meeting, as opposed to an asynchronous exchange? What makes you say this needs a meeting?
the pieces that the value creation is what meetings should be about. If I was to draw the line, I mean, that's a very big line, but things, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious to people. I mean, we're building software. We're not dummies. Like, we know when something doesn't need to be in a meeting. We know when we're wasting people's time. And, the other thing that happened with the pandemic is people got used to bad meetings, right? And so
Yes.
it's sort of like the status quo, and they got good at being in bad meetings, right? So people are on Zoom. They got good at like keeping their eye contact on the camera while still having like Minesweeper open on the right, or digging through their email or multitasking, and that's unhealthy. That's not a real. That's the astronauts or the engineers in Apollo 13 weren't doing that. They weren't playing
Yes.
checking their email on the side during the meeting. So I think you're optimizing the async pieces are to optimize for value creating meetings, human collaboration.
Yeah.
And also, making sure that people have the space to do deep work and think,
Yes.
that because that's a big part of building software is just making constant tiny decisions all the
Yes.
time. And so you need
Yes.
space for that.
Yeah. Love that. So far, what I got is there is a small loop that is more about
Yes.
tactics, about probably coordinating on small tasks. I'm pushing this PR, this needs to be released today, coordinating among engineers what I need to do. I'm blocked by this or that. And then there is a larger loop, which is more about things you are achieving and the outcome of work that needs to be measured against larger goals on a bi-weekly or monthly basis, or anyway
Right.
it's a larger loop. And I love when you mentioned the alignment trap, so the fact that there exists such a thing as too much alignment, right? Because
Right.
people and I think it's good to discuss, because alignment is mostly perceived as a good thing, so it might not be immediately evident that there is such a thing as too much alignment. And instead, what I think this ties in nicely with another of your principle, that is lead with context. I think people should be mindful about what people should be aligned on, and what instead should be left to independent contribution of people
Yes.
about how to do things. So what is your take on that? So what is good alignment, and what is bad alignment that maybe gets into micromanagement and all bad things?
Yeah. Well, so alignment, from a manager's perspective, or a leader's perspective, is really about confidence, right? That's the underlying emotion. Like, I talked before about walking into the room and seeing that whiteboard and seeing the jackets and the chairs and just not really feeling like my hands are on the wheel.
Yeah.
Like that was, that we might have been misaligned at that moment. We probably were. But really, like, the underlying emotion was confidence, and confidence feeds alignment. But what you're talking about is how the other principles actually start to fit in.
Yeah.
So one of the principles is tell the future.
Hmm.
And what that means in these async coordination pieces, it's not only what happened, or a risk assessment, or what happened with this goal. It's what's the intention? What are you planning to do? So in the small loop, it's like, I'm Henry, I'm a contributor. My plan for the day is to ship the reporting module.
Hmm.
Um, so when I'm telling the future like that, my manager has a chance to, or any other person who's within that loop has a chance to correct any misalignment
Yeah.
before it happens, because it's happening before I work on it. And tell the future is a principle that was inspired by a book by a former Navy sub-commander named David Marquette. And he wrote a book called "Turn the Ship Around," and it's in one of the credits for the receipts for continuous coordination, tell the future. And what he did is he realized that he had a command and control structure on the ship, and he was in charge of the worst performing ship in the Navy, and he had to figure out a way to make it, to turn it around. And surprise, surprise, he made it the best performing ship or sub in the Navy. And one of the ways that he did that was to lean on intent. And so instead of commanding people down who were close to where the context was for decisions, people operating controls of a submarine, looking at depth or looking at pressure and looking at those kind of things, instead of them like looking up and saying, hey, what do I do now? He taught them to look up and say, hey, Captain, I intend to,
Yeah.
move this dial to the left or
Yeah.
dive the sub. And so they were telling the future, and they were giving, they still had autonomy. They were still making decisions, which is what you need in a high performing software team. But it still gave the stakeholders, the commanders,
Yeah.
the officers, a chance to align if they were misaligned, right?
Yeah.
And so that again, like, the other principles support keep a steady beat, right?
Yeah.
And another one is lead with context too. So by the time that I am making an asynchronous contribution, I have all the context I need because my leadership and management has given it to me
Yeah,
through their
I love the
communication loops.
example also because it shows that alignment is a two-way street. It's not just, alignment from managers down to directs, about what needs to be achieved, which is probably the most common angle that gets discussed, but
Yeah,
also alignment from people who do the work towards the manager about what is going to happen, and creating the confidence in both parties that everybody is in the right direction.
that's
Also,
right.
I think the title of the book, Turn the Ship Around, is fantastic because
Yeah,
especially when you learn that it's an actual ship, it's not a metaphor, it's Navy commander,
that's
so
right.
it's
It's
yeah,
like real.
yeah,
Yes,
it's a real
yes,
ship, and it also shows, I mean, that lessons in working together, in coordination, as you name it, are really universal. I mean, it doesn't matter if you are in the Navy turning a little ship or shipping software, to keep using the word ship. Uh,
yes,
but
yes,
things, I mean, good principles keep working wherever you are.
yeah.
I think these are great principles, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of an engineering manager or a team lead who works on a team and wants to try to apply some of these things to their situations.
Hmm.
And of course, it's not
Hmm.
greenfield. They have already something in
Right,
place, ceremonies or way of working together. They have
right.
their own loops, and maybe some of them are
Yes.
sync, some of them are not. So what should they do? I mean, what does successful continuous coordination look like in practice, and how you can put that to work?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. So, first and foremost, the other principles that are there, those are based on, we didn't come up with those out of thin air. They're proven principles. So,
Yeah.
leading with context, work in the open, which is about transparency, write it down, which is essentially that writing is thinking, and to encourage a writing culture, especially if you're doing async coordination work. But you have to embody those things as the manager if you're going to, and lead by example if you expect your team
Mm,
members to do them. So an anti-pattern would be like, hey, let's set up a small coordination loop and then not participate in it, right?
mm.
So
So leading by
the first
example.
thing, leading by example with the other principles in
Yeah.
particular. So yes, there's two. The manager has two concerns, right? So they are the servant leader for the team. So they need to have their team on board, which means really giving them the context and being open about the benefit to them.
Okay.
And usually, right away, it's about, hey, I understand your time is valuable and I'm going to respect it. And we are going to set up this asynchronous coordination loop so that by the time you are in a meeting, you are valued and we are working on value creation and your time is not going to be wasted. So that's an important benefit for the contributors to understand. And it's usually plenty to get them on board because, you know, nothing is more demoralizing than sitting in a meeting waiting for, Luca and Henry to finish talking about Jira ticket 1472, right? It's
Yeah.
it's kind of disrespectful to the other people's time. They never get that time
Totally.
back.
Yeah.
So emphasizing that and emphasizing the fact that you're protecting the team with these things and you're optimizing for their time so that they can create value. That's very important. So that's the piece with the contributors, and then with the stakeholders. It's sort of it's like the lessons that I learned in management consulting. It's all about setting expectations on a regular basis and meeting them. So essentially, the challenge is to subscribe your stakeholders to the larger loop
Okay.
somehow. So
Okay.
it's like, okay, stakeholder, I know I have to ship this thing by the end of Q4. You're going to get an update from me about how that is going every 2 weeks. And here's how you're going to get it. And it'll give you a chance because I'm going to be telling the future. I'm going to tell you what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you what's working, what's not. I'm going to tell you where we're blocked. And you're going to get a chance at that point to give me some input, and you will be apprised of where we're at all the way along.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's a big selling point to stakeholders because usually they're a mix of directors or execs, or they might be, who knows, reporting to a board or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, they need those updates. And, that feeling when you're running a big project where you're like, "Ah, I really wish I knew it was happening here. I have to go bug
Yes.
somebody. I wish I was getting pushed that information instead of me
Yeah.
having to like reach in and pull it all the time." So that's a selling point as well for a manager to try to get something like this
Yeah.
implemented within an org. It's not about, hey, we're changing our whole philosophy. It's like, let's boil the frog here. It's like, on this one project, you're you're going to get an update from me every 2 weeks. Let's see how it goes.
Okay. Okay. So basically, what I'm getting is there are the bigger loop is about keeping, especially stakeholders, which do not participate the whole action of the team in
Right.
sync with what is going to be achieved, what has been shipped and achieved in terms of actual goals. Then the small loop in the small loop, the main characters are the individual contributors, I mean, who run
Right.
all the action, and of course, stakeholders do not belong there. And the manager is probably bridging the gap, keeping an eye on the small loop if anything needs to be unblocked or needs their intervention,
Right.
while also crafting, let's say, the larger loop for the other stakeholders.
There's another analogy here too. Is in the Scrum world, there's Scrum and the Scrum of Scrums.
Yeah.
Like usually the big loop is a good mechanism for the Scrum of Scrums, because stakeholders, don't forget, that could be your boss or your boss's boss or whoever, but it also goes sideways. It's the dependencies with other teams, with a security team, with an infrastructure team, with a DevOps team.
Yeah.
And so having a central place for that async communication is very important,
Yeah.
particularly when there's complex dependencies involved.
Yeah. And let's say you start from a situation that, I mean, it's hard to win some inertia, probably initially, especially when you have to change ceremonies you have in place. So how would, maybe you don't need to, maybe some of what you do is already working. And how would you assess, for example, your current situation, and you maybe you would identify points of friction that can be improved? Is it maybe like how many meetings you're running, how much time you're wasting on this or that, or how well the information gets across the various stakeholders? I mean, you're sitting you're joining a new team, and you want to
Mm.
figure out how things are going in that department. Let's say, what would you look for?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. One, you hit on kind of both of them.
Yeah,
There's a subjective part, and there's a quantitative or objective part. Is the subjective part is a feeling of confidence. Is that there?
yeah,
Does this feel? And we know this from being in software for so long. Do you feel like you've got your hands on the wheel, that you know what's happening, that you feel good about the deadlines, you feel good about code quality, you feel good about the people that are working on the project. So it's a subjective piece too. But again, going back to meetings are a great way to register that. Are we having meetings where there's no value being created? And if that's the case, there's probably some tweaks that need to be made at the very least.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I want to enlarge the scope a little bit, because you have been working on these themes for so many years, from even before the pandemic, as we said, to the pandemic shift to now post-pandemic, and there has been the shift to remote work, and now there is all this shift to using AI inside teams for all kind of things. So from your perspective, working with hundreds of companies, are you looking at some trends of how engineering and product teams are changing the way they're working together, and what is expected maybe by different roles within the team?
Yeah, for sure. So, but I think more than a trend, we're in a mix of inflection points.
Mm,
So, like I said before, time and place for work, once constants in the work equation, are now variable. So we got to figure that out. The other piece is just 20 years of Agile and Scrum and tools and processes, and most of the tools we use today were kind of made before the pandemic, right? And we work differently now. We got used to working in a different way.
yeah,
I talked to a friend of mine who works at a big company, and they went back 5 days a week. And I asked him what the difference was, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And he said, well, pre-pandemic, the conference rooms were always full, and the whiteboards were always had stuff on them,
yeah,
right? Because people were always gathering and forming
yeah,
ideas and collaborating. He said, now everybody's back, but the whiteboards are empty. People got used to like communicating on Zoom and multitasking and doing these things. And just because we switched around this place where they
Yeah.
go and made a trade-off there, it's not actually getting people back to where they were before as far as coordination goes. So that's one piece. But generally, I think there's an over-engineering problem with all of our tools and processes. And here I am talking about another process, but but generally, but people, we ask so much of developers because again, doing any kind of software development task is really about making decisions, just decision after decision after decision. Like, what do I name
Yeah.
this variable? Which library do I use? Where does this file go? Like all of that. How does this fit into the context of the story? So you have to go and gather that context in order to make the decisions.
Yeah.
And now we ask people to just dip into so many layers of
Yeah.
context. And it's really hard. And some stuff is in people's heads too. It's not
Yes.
like in a database somewhere. It's like, there might be a person who understands how the database connector works within a company. Like that information is institutional knowledge that's buried in somebody's head. So we're asking developers to puzzle all that together on their own
Mm.
and navigate just this really complex toolscape right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a trend as well. And then the third one you mentioned is managing AI expectations.
Mm.
So now we're asking another thing of this management layer, right? It's like, okay, I might have some board member or some exec who read an article in the Wall Street Journal about, developer productivity and AI and
Yeah.
can we fire people? Can we do more with less? How do we be more productive with AI? Go,
Yeah.
and then that manager still has to like somehow, okay, I'm not sure. And then talk to the team about that as well, who are also, fearful and fearing probably the thing that this exec is
Yeah.
saying, like, oh, do I have a job here? So,
Yes.
AI managing that expectation, it's a mix of FOMO and just absolute skepticism that I think is hard to navigate. So I think those are the three trends that are that have things in upheaval right now. And so we are trying to address that with continuous coordination and with Steady. I mean, Steady has an AI implementation, and we have a point of view about AI, and we have a point of view about how it can assist
Yeah.
and not replace
Yeah.
cyborgs, not robots.
Yeah.
But I think those are the three things that I think
Yeah.
is emerging as trends, whether we like them or not. The status quo is very powerful. People are in big orgs are used to just sitting in meetings all day. Like they've decided that's okay.
Yeah.
And my point of view is it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You touched on so many good points, and I love the story by your friend that after people got back in the office, whiteboards were still empty. And
Yes.
it got me thinking really because after the pandemic, there are companies who stuck with remote work, and especially maybe startups embraced more of it, while big tech and larger companies uh, pedaled back. That they are issuing return to office, and we know that. But basically, this story is saying that there is a piece of this that is not going to ever be as it was before. So do you think that even if you go back, you have been working remotely for like 2 years, for example, you go back to the office tomorrow. So you think there are things that you learned while working remotely that are going to come with you when you go back to the office in a way that you can just expect people to behave like they did before. So no more like impromptu meetings out of the blue all the every day, maybe as it was before. And so are there things that remote work has taught teams that they can apply even in co-located situations in the office?
Well, I think the biggest one, and it's one we advocate for in continuous coordination, is that giving the freedom to communicate um, ad hoc in a way that makes sense for collaboration and creating value.
Yeah.
is very important. And the lesson from remote work, hopefully, is that if you have a plan for structured coordination, it
Yeah.
frees you up for that kind of value creation and interactions, no matter where you are, remote or distributed
Yes.
or hybrid or wherever. Putting that stuff aside. I mean, even I've been in office environments and
Yeah.
sat through boring meetings there too.
Yeah.
It's there's that big that meme that goes around like with the whole RTO debate, like about the gray, big, boring office, and it's like
Yeah.
this is not the place of collaboration, right?
Yeah.
But certainly running into people, having face-to-face conversation is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
And so, making room for that, I think, is probably the biggest lesson by having a structured plan for the
Yeah.
rote stuff, for the status, for the updates, for the intentions, for keeping people up to date with context, for mission, for goals, for transparency.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably that it's just that remote work is in a way a forcing function of to think about processes intentionally, because otherwise you don't just bump into people, and so you have to be intentional naturally about how
Yeah,
you communicate. But
yeah,
this way of being intentional benefits you even when you're at the office. So if you are good at
yes,
implementing, for example, we mentioned the small loop, the larger loop, these things you take them with you, and they benefit you even in hybrid and co-located offices. And you should be good at keeping those things and keeping the good things of the office, like FaceTime together, bonding. I know maybe it's a roses and flowers scenario, but that should be how you get the best of both worlds, which is tricky, but maybe it can be done.
yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, essentially what we've lost through the pandemic is this notion of management by walking around,
Yeah.
right? That's sort of gone. And so, how do you feel that? I mean, and that papered over a lot of bad management practices too.
Yeah.
But how do you facilitate that kind of thing? And I think, yes, you're right. The most important thing is using structured communication loops to make sure that you leave the room for the real
Yeah.
collaboration, and not engaging in this debate really. I mean, modern work is distributed.
Yeah.
Hybrid, back to office, even the most stalwart back to office folks are, not really doing that. They're
Yeah.
40s a week, or they're hybrid.
This is not
It's the
going
world
back.
has changed. Yes, it's distributed. The genie is out of the bottle. So we got to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned AI, and I think you're right at saying that especially managers are under a lot of pressure to come up with an AI strategy and figure out how AI should magically multiply the productivity of their teams. And you mentioned that you are kind of opinionated about how AI can help teams with processes. So do you think we are still in the phase of exploration and figuring out what we can do, or are there already some things that we have figured out that surely benefit the way we communicate and work together thanks to AI?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both.
Mm,
So certainly in Steady, we think we've figured out some of it. So there is some stat I saw the other day about how much time developers spend actually coding
mm,
in their job, right?
yeah,
And the stat is like 15%.
yeah,
You
less,
know,
way less than we
which
think.
way less than we think, because again, like software is about editing. Really, it's not really about like producing lines of code, which is another continuous coordination principle about measuring outcomes and output, not input. Like how many
Yeah,
lines of code did I write? That's meaningless. So even if you decided that the writing of the code part was entirely replaced by AI, you've taken away 15% of the developer's day. So the best that, in theory, the best that like a Copilot would do, a GitHub Copilot, is take away,
yeah.
give you a 15% boost, maybe, but we
That's
all
a
know
wake
that
up
that's not the
call
case.
for many,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, yeah. So, and I think that's that's what we're seeing right now, is a little backlash of like, wait a sec, I was sort of promised the world here,
Yeah,
and that's not really the case. I still need these people to think about stuff. So, with Steady, we think that, again, like our mission with Steady is tailored summaries and weekly readership on these summaries to give everybody sort of a presidential daily brief about what's happening and have context at any given time for any person in the org. And AI is a boon for that, right? Because we are ingesting a kind of a unique set of data. We have human intentions, written human intentions, people writing out their plans for the day, and then we have like PRs, and we have Jira ticket comments and things like that, and we're able to, even in the last 6 months, the way these models have changed, ingest that and synthesize it in a way that's really helpful to our customers. And so that's where we think the juice is in the synthesization and pattern analysis and finding insights there.
Yeah, I love this.
Assisting.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree, because I think one of the most unique capabilities of AI is exactly this summarization and making sense of a lot of different kinds of information in a way that is very similar or even superior in many cases to what a human would do. So I mean, you mentioned
Yes.
aggregating data from multiple sources and maybe extracting recommendations or action items. I mean, if not through AI, I couldn't think probably of a way of doing that through deterministic algorithms.
Yes, it's difficult. Yeah, I mean, it does open up the door for that in a way that's really compelling, especially with the way the language, the models are developing. But yeah, I mean, just putting a sparkly button into a product, I have a lot of opinions on some products that have done that. I think that's produces a lot of false hope on really moving the needle on productivity.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I love the insight about it's 15% of the time that people spend on code. So that's what you can possibly get in your wildest expectation if you're thinking just of GitHub Copilot,
Yeah, and that's assuming everything's fixed on hallucinations. That's
Yes,
assuming
of
everything's
course.
fixed on receipts, like all of those things, that are
Everything
still
works out of the
out there.
box on the first try.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Never be the
Which
case.
it doesn't.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Henry, thank you so much for this chat. We covered a lot of ground. So, I loved your take, and I will go deeper into continuous coordination and we'll explore the framework. So, thank you so much for being here with us today again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Luca, and congratulations on all the success you've had with refactoring. It's a great community.
Thank you, and congratulations to you as well.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.